You want to get started with introductions then?
Yeah, all right. Let's get started with introductions.
So just in case you can't see us on your screen or in person, there are photographs of us on the slide, so you can work out which of us is which.
Lauren.
For myself, I've been a software developer since 2001, and I've been working in software ever since in a variety of roles. For the past 10 years, I've been the owner and principal consultant at Parallel 42 Systems. Our services run the gamut from helping folks get new software and purchase new software and find the right software for their company, all the way to pretty complex software development engagements.
Nice. So my name is Lauren. I've been working with Parallel 42 since the fall of 2018. Prior to that, I was working in a diner, so I do not have as much tech experience as Doug. My background is in a very different realm of technology. I went to school for audio engineering and then later on for digital journalism, communications, and film. So when it comes to project management, I really learned by running film sets, by being the music director at a radio station, and by working for myself, essentially, not at the diner. Obviously, that was not self-employment, but I did a lot of freelance media production, journalism, things like that. And all of those kinds of experiences, and honestly, waitressing too, because you really have to get with the customer service and you have to think about a million things at once and you have to be able to work while you're tired. So all of those things really kind of came together to help me be a decent project manager, even though when I started with Doug, I was like, what's JavaScript? So we're getting better.
Overall, our focus is on delivering quality software to end users. And that's just not as easy as it sounds. Fred Brooks wrote a book back in 1970, I want to say, called The Mythical Man Month. And he was one of the first and most important writers on the process of software development. Brooks compared developing software to building castles in the air. And I think that's a really important point because software is a man-made abstraction that has no real world reference point. Next slide, please. So there are an infinite number of ways to solve a problem with software, and there is an even larger infinite number of ways to fail to solve that problem with software. A lot of the tools and processes that we've built around software are aimed at building a consensus model of what we need to make and how we're going to make it. And I find that developing software from unclear specs is one of the biggest risks you can take with a project. It's true in any field. Before I was a programmer, I worked in construction, and clarity matters in construction too. Poorly planned construction projects will run into challenges that bust their budgets too. The big difference, though, is that when we're talking about construction, we have 10,000 years experience putting up buildings. As a species. And we have a pretty good sense of what is required to start a building project. And we have a host of professional and legal controls to make sure that all that information and the plans for a project are prepared and executed according to well understood design principles and standards. There is someone with a license who designed your building. And if your building falls down, that person's license gets taken away. That doesn't happen in software. You can write a piece of software that falls over and be back to work the next day. We still have to build real products, though, in the software business. And that means that success and failure are pretty easy for everybody to see. So, it's really important to have a process that recognizes, I think, the intangible and flexible nature of software.
Over the years that Doug and I have been working together, we've come to land on a pretty quality process, but it's one that is still going, still changing. We've really got here by trial and error. We try things. If it doesn't work, move on to the next thing, but also by listening to the people we interact with, whether it's somebody who's on our team or our client. Sometimes we try something and it doesn't work and we tweak it and then it does work, or we just throw it out entirely. But by really listening to everybody who's involved, we're able to get a lot of different perspectives to find what really works.
And I think just an important point in talking about building quality software is that you have to understand what quality means to the users and to the people who are paying for that software development. It can mean different things in different contexts. And one of the things that we have to do through our discovery process is actually figure out, what does quality mean to you and what is quality in this situation? And with that, we're going to put up the big, scary numbers. Okay. The discipline of software development is less than a century old in comparison to the 10,000 plus year history of building construction. What we think of as modern software development didn't really get started until the 1970s. The business also has a lot of fads and fashions. Things that will, magic bullets and ways to solve every problem that go in and out of style. Consistent project success is still elusive. Project failure is endemic. If you search Google, you'll find statistics like the ones on this slide that indicate that between 60 and 98% of corporate IT projects fail. Like just about everybody else in the business, I have had some really unfortunate experiences with failed projects. And I've noticed some common features to projects that succeed versus those that fail. Working a project doomed to fail is a super miserable experience, and I don't recommend it to anyone, and I don't want it for me, and I don't want it for my team. We spent a lot of time building out a process that works for us, and I think it's fair to say that we enjoy a rate of project success that's a little bit higher than what you see here on the slide.
I would agree with that. Yeah, it's pretty common to see technical projects identified in the project post-mortem, but that can be a red herring. Technical work fails for the same reasons that other projects fail: unrealistic or unclear project goals, insufficient budget, and poor communication. The best defense against these problems is a solid process that's well understood by the entire team and the client.
Okay, so we've got a slide about project failure, but I want to talk about project success. And one project that I recall really fondly is the time that I worked with a financial institution client, and I worked with one business analyst automating financial reporting. It's a textbook example of setting up for success. I had enough time to work on a well-scoped problem with a team of people who were committed to project success, and they were willing to work through the obstacles that we ran into along the way. Everybody wanted this thing to succeed, and nobody saw any advantage in undermining the others or had any goals besides achieving the project. And in this specific case, the good folks from the client finance department were part of the team and my client for the work. Engaged, knowledgeable clients supporting the work is absolutely essential. So I like this slide. So with a team that small, with a two-person team, you don't need a whole lot in the way of formal process. I had known that client a long time, and we know how to work together really well. So we relied on an informal process, the informal process that many of you probably know and follow, which is talking to each other a lot. And it can work great in a small group that has a ton of trust and communication. Two experienced people with complementary skills and a shared history is a pretty ideal setup. I knew what to expect from my BA, and she knew what to expect from me. And in my view, the goal of a well-designed project management process is to get as close to this ideal as possible with teams that are larger and more capable of solving interesting problems.
So there are risks that come with working on a team this small. We might have heard of the bus factor or the lottery factor. Someone this week that I was speaking to referred to it as going to Mars. So if somebody is for some reason just gone all of a sudden, that is like a huge risk if your team is only two people, like Doug's case. If one of them was gone, then that means 50% of your team and the knowledge that they have is now evaporated. So learning to anticipate and mitigate this kind of risk does not always come easy, but it's definitely worth developing. Risk mitigation starts as soon as the project kicks off and doesn't end until months after the project has been delivered. That part might sound a little bit odd. Why is there still risk if the project is done? Because something could go wrong. something could break down. Your team member that knew that part intimately is now gone and you can't access them anymore. That's a risk that you're still taking, even though the project has been delivered. So it's important to keep a line of communication open with your team for quite some time afterwards. And usually this is something that you can establish with the client ahead of time, that, you know, if something goes wrong, we can support you for up to 6 months. After that, then we have to look at, you know, a new engagement that we have to set up to be able to take this kind of work on. And what that means is giving yourselves time to ramp up on it. Sometimes what happens is a client will even come back like way later. We had a client do this once, that they came out probably a year and a half later, and we had to relearn what we had previously done because it had been so long. We'd worked on so many projects in the meantime that even though it was the same team, the skills were not up to par anymore. So imagine what happens if your key team member who led a project like that is no longer around. So that's another reason to make sure that you keep your documentation and all of your notes really clear, concise, and available and easy to find. So losing a team member is never going to be a pleasant experience, regardless of which point you're at in the process, but there are ways to make it survivable. Building off the basics of clear project goals and communication, tools like shared notes, standard procedures, and a good project plan will help to keep a project on track, even when the team size and personnel changes. These approaches all remain helpful as projects and teams expand, but they will require more work to keep them useful. So it can't just be like you talking to one person and having it work. And then when the team grows, we had that internally too. As our team got bigger, we couldn't just all fit in a tiny closet office that we used to sit in. We had to upgrade to a bigger space.
Yep, for sure. A couple things I wanted to pick up on. One in particular is the idea that a software project can ever be done is adorable to me. And you know, software, it requires maintenance forever. Just like your building requires maintenance, the difference is that building maintenance can often be performed by people who don't know anything about the construction of the building and didn't have any, you know, didn't see the plans. But that's not how software maintenance works. You're going to need to be able to engage people who have intimate knowledge and understanding of the software that was built. And building on your point, Lauren, I think that having quality documentation is super important. And the true test of your documentation is whether you can lose a team member and still be able to continue to work, even if that person is gone to Mars and not available.
All right. So on our last slide, I ended talking about communication on small teams and then how we need to scale all of that. So good communication becomes even more important and more difficult to achieve the larger your team gets. Project methodologies like Scrum use well-defined ceremonies to structure communication, which can be an immense help to project managers, but ceremony isn't a magic bullet, and sometimes it's only a crutch. So you mentioned earlier that you are like a big nerd, big fan of Agile. You're either going to love or hate our process. I'm just going to give you a heads up.
I judge neither. I think that's why I'm like interested, because like every process is made. The best process is the process that is tuned for the team that's using it.
Bingo.
Love it. Yeah, you get it. So over the years, we've tried various exercises that come from Agile and other methodologies like planning poker and sprint retrospectives, and we've gradually dropped the ones that don't work. We've become more efficient in our meetings and in our written communications, and we've learned that not only do different projects have different requirements, sometimes our team as a whole has different needs. For example, our weekly meetings, they used to be one meeting per week that covered all projects. And then we've had times where it's like one meeting per project per week or per project every other week. And it always shifts around. It just depends what everybody's working on and what the specific projects entail. These days, we meet as a whole team once every 2 weeks, and that's been pretty much working for us. If we were forcing ourselves to stick to that one meeting schedule per week all the time, we would be making our lives harder. We would either not be focused enough on our projects, like one project wouldn't be getting enough time, or we would be forcing ourselves to spend too much time in meetings, which doesn't really help anybody at all. The goal is to be as productive as possible. So we really try not to waste time in our meetings with like too many extra things. I know some folks, I've worked on some teams before where they would start every team meeting with an icebreaker. And
bless those people.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. It was horrible. I hated it. It was not like a development team like this one, but that concept was just, I learned from working with that company and that team that was not something that I wanted to do. And it's not something I've ever brought in. What we did here with our introduce yourselves at the beginning, that's the most icebreakery of a thing that I have ever done at an event or a meeting. And even that, we tried it out for the first time today, and I'll see if we keep doing it because I don't really know how that went. We'll talk about it afterwards. But basically, being flexible to the needs of projects and people is imperative.
And I think we're going to touch on this time and time again. It's really important to recognize that a lot of the things that we're talking about work in our context. As you pointed out, Anthony, every development group, every company, the context will be different. And for us, context changes from project to project. And I think the most important thing especially in a small organization, when you have the luxury of pretty easy communication, you have a small group to communicate with, it's not so hard to keep everybody in the loop. When you have that, take advantage of it. Take advantage of the opportunity to be able to say, you know what, guys, this meeting every week isn't working for us. I think we all recognize that, and we're going to now meet every 2 weeks. These should not be painful or controversial changes, and setting a tone that everyone needs to be flexible, I think, can be helpful. So we've had to refine our written communication as the team grew. Once upon a time, there were only 3 of us at Parallel 42, and we relied mostly on Facebook Messenger. These days, we're a team of 13, and we're working on at least a half dozen projects at a time. So obviously, we outgrew Messenger and developed a new approach of taking an asynchronous approach to written communication, which, if any of you folks have had the experience of working remotely, this is something that I think a lot of organizations have begun to experience more and more since the pandemic and remote work became more of a reality for people. So now we have one chat per project. We maintain individual sidebar conversations, of course, between ourselves, and we have a general team thread. So that might sound like a lot of different ways to communicate with each other, but it actually makes things easier. When I'm not involved in a project, I don't need to be in that thread, and I don't need to be bombarded with those notifications. And when I need to look back and see what was said in Project A last week, I don't have to worry about the amount of chatter in Project B and that noise overwhelms the info that I'm interested in. So there's something else embedded there, though. It's not just that we've created all of these different channels. It's that we have discipline as a team about using those communication channels in the way that they were designed. And one of the ways that works in our team is that everyone on the team is empowered to call out when communication isn't working or when there is a challenge in communication, and that really helps. You don't want it to be one person's call that this isn't working or that's not the way you're supposed to do that. I mean, people should be able to police themselves in a friendly and an informal manner to keep the conversations where they need to be. Okay, there's a lot of advice out there about the project management process, and I guess we're adding to it tonight. A lot of it is valuable. I'll let you guys decide for yourselves about whether tonight's presentation is valuable. But I think one thing that I recommend is thinking about the foundational principles of your approach and the outcomes that you're aiming for. Not every project has the same goals, and different outcomes call for varying process. At Parallel 42, we start with a very lightweight process. We've described it a little bit based on agile principles, and we make adjustments for each project based on the requirements and expectations. So one common dimension that we look at on software projects is correctness balanced with pace of delivery. A client who's building a commercial product to scale has entirely different needs in terms of the correctness and accuracy of that software compared to a small organization looking for tools to make their workflow more efficient. In one case, distributing buggy software is going to have an impact on potentially thousands of users. impact their own individual productivity, and create a whole lot of work just to get all of those client situations sorted out, updated, dealt with. If you're working on a piece of software that is run by one person, a piece of software that is only used occasionally, used for a single purpose, to me, these are indicators that we don't need quite as heavy or tight a process, because we're not considering, as many multiple different possible risks, and the stakes are just lower. And when the stakes are lower, you can afford to take bigger risks.
So when we're gathering initial requirements from our clients, we're thinking about process and asking the questions that will help us to design a solid process that supports the project goals. This goes back to earlier where I discussed that the process is going to change per project. How much of this we negotiate directly with our clients depends on how involved in our process they will be. I'm going to take away your ability to scroll.
Don't do that. When we engage as a blended team, we need a lot more consensus around process matters than when we're acting as hired guns. So an additional complication for us in those blended projects is that we have to adapt to client processes and client culture, which is a lesson that we constantly relearn, while maintaining our ability to manage our own team in the direction of success. And so these can be heavy discussions. We try to support existing processes as much as possible. And the way that we do that is we develop our own process in conversation with the client process. And what I mean by that is if I know that my client has a very detail-oriented engineering culture, for instance, then we're going to make sure that we're providing the details that they're interested in, and that our process is set up to capture that information up front and not create a lot of headaches for the project management team chasing down details that are going to be later needed.
The confrontational approach to these conversations is counterproductive in most cases, and it can actually be dangerous when you don't fully understand the cultural and political realities that drive an organization. When you've been working with somebody for a couple of weeks, you've been to their office once or twice and done a bunch of Zoom calls with them, you don't know enough about who they are as a business to really talk too much about their process. There's probably a very good reason for it, or there's potentially a very good reason for it. So it's better to adapt to a suboptimal process than to make waves unless the process threatens project success. This can be a tough call to make, and we generally don't go there until we've tried to make the necessary adjustments on our end. No matter the size, for every project we take on at P42, we start with what we call Sprint Zero. This is a scoping engagement during which we gather requirements, create process flows and mock-ups, research our options, and ultimately design the solution. Sometimes this engagement can be a little bit hard to sell to clients as they don't always see the value of this stage. They don't want to pay a bill without receiving a tangible handoff. And in this case, a report isn't what they have in mind since they're hiring us for software development. But whether we break this out as a separate engagement or not, all of this work still needs to be done. All of these steps still have to be gone through. We can't start building before we understand the problem and to design the solution. Another benefit to Sprint Zero is that it gives both us and the client the chance to decide if we do in fact want to take the next step together. Sometimes a project is going to take longer and cost more than the client expects, and they choose to end it here. Totally okay. Sometimes we learn that the problem to be solved is less complicated than originally assumed, and it can be rectified with an off-the-shelf solution. We've definitely found that more than twice. In some cases, we learn that there is some sort of mismatch. It could be cultural, it could be timeline, whatever, and the customer will choose to take our Sprint Zero report and bring it to another developer to implement. Since they compensated us for our time to create the document, this doesn't generally hurt our feelings. So some people will feel weird about charging for that kind of scoping, requirements gathering part of it, but you have to. Yeah, you're agreeing. I like that.
So do you hold? Can I ask a question? Sorry.
Sure.
So do you do this Sprint Zero, and then before you start active development, you set up like another
like a new
contractor?
Yeah. So we use the scoping engagement to determine what the contract needs to be. Mm-hmm. Because until we have figured out what the solution is, we don't know how long it's going to take, how many people we need, how much money it's going to cost, right? So the scoping engagement allows us to write out the quote. We have to be careful sometimes with how we phrase that, because to some people, they're like, you charge me for a quote, but that's not what we're doing. We're charging you to find your solution, right? It's the same thing, but terminology matters. Some people get their back up over certain things.
Yeah, and I think it's important in thinking about that process, like the scoping engagement sometimes reveals that the initial thoughts that we had either on our side or on the client side about what this project was or what the problem is or what the solution space possibly looks like, those ideas were wrong. And one of the things that happens, I mean, change orders are a thing and projects can be adjusted and modified, but one of the things that happens when you embark on a project is that it anchors in everyone's mind, this is what we're doing. We're building X. And if you start building X and then 1/3 of the way through or 1/10 of the way through, you decide that you actually need to build Y, that's going to look an awful lot like failure to a lot of people. So one of the things that I think is a hidden value of, sorry about that, Eric. One of the things that I think is a hidden value of the Sprint Zero, I'm sorry, a joke came through and it just totally discombobulated me, but one of the hidden values of the Sprint Zero process is that we really avoid that whole class of project failure of like, you know, how do we tell the emperor that he's naked? Right? How do we actually communicate this thing that is now going to be so uncomfortable to communicate that it's a problem? Because we don't do any work until Sprint 1 starts, any real development work.
And it's important to remember, too, that whether you're a third party contracted by an organization like us, or if you're an internal developer working at an established company as a developer, this process of requirements gathering, solutioning, mocking up, and estimating is essential. Like it still has to be done. Just because you are working for a company that has you building software for their internal use doesn't mean that you don't have to spec out your solution. So you still have to go through this process, even if the quoting and the negotiation that comes from it is a little bit different. The order matters here as well. Solutioning before you've gathered requirements and an understanding on the problem to be solved obviously doesn't make sense. Similarly, estimating before mockups are drawn up and approved by the client generally means that you either have to be very restrictive on your UI choices or you'll be going over budget. Neither of these is ideal, especially when the problem can be avoided with proper process. Are you counting how many times we say process and how many times we say process?
I'm not. We can we can watch the video later and tally that up.
Yeah.
It's really valuable to tune your process to organizational realities, make adjustments when you see what's working and what's not working. At the same time, tinkering with process can be a real time waster, and it can undermine your credibility if you're constantly making tweaks to the way that you work. So I find, as I mentioned before, open communication is a really good solution here. If we're going to make a change, it's ideal if the reasons are understood by everyone around the table. Warming up a process change by building consensus around the issue is something that works really well in my experience. I mean, warming up any kind of change by helping the stakeholders understand like what the consequences, good and bad, of that change will be, I think is just a good idea in general.
When our development team does change an established process, it's either in response to a client's need or to an identified problem. When possible, we wait until the start of a new project or at the very least a new sprint before we implement it. Sometimes these changes end up being long-term. For example, we no longer manage project tasks through a combination of Trello boards and spreadsheets. Instead, we all collaborate via ClickUp. And sometimes a process change lasts only as long as a particular client or project is around. Like in the case of a past client who required an internal staging site for a development project. This meant that we had separate environments for dev, QA, client staging, and production. On most of our projects, even today, we will use one environment as both QA and client staging, but this was a process that was necessary in the past and will likely come up again in the future, so it's good that we know how to deal with it. Again, the ability to be flexible to the needs of the client, project, and people involved is key to project success. Sometimes we'll even have it where different stages of the project do need a different approach to process. In general, I don't ask the devs to give me a recap of their day at 5 o'clock. I just kind of trust that they're working. They fill out their timesheets. I can see any, merge requests that they've put through. I feel pretty good about it. But sometimes if a project is like shaky or we're getting close to deadline and I'm not feeling super confident, that's when I'll tell them, all right, now I need you to check in with me every day on what you're accomplishing. And because I don't make them do this all the time, they don't hate me for asking them to do it for a couple of weeks at a time. If I made them do it always, mutiny. So you have to pick and choose when to bring in certain tools.
Okay. All right. So now we're getting into what I think is the really fun segment of this talk, which is project breakers. So let's talk about, and it was also super fun finding all the woodcuts to use as images to go with these slides. In a new project environment, I'm always curious about where authority and responsibility lie on the organizational chart and how that compares to the reality on the ground. When authority is diffuse, it can be hard to generate the support that you need for the changes that are required. If a lot of people can be an obstacle to a project, in my experience, somebody will be. And if the person that I'm reporting through is not the only or ultimate authority over the work to be done, that represents a significant project risk that has to be addressed. And that's something that we've learned through plenty of experience. Depending on the situation, you can handle this in different ways. The ideal is to align project leadership with authority over the project by developing a line of communication to the correct authorities. That's not always possible.
We actually experienced this on a software development project that ran for a few years. We were implementing and customizing a pretty big, complex system that had a lot of different modules to it. Everything was going fairly smoothly until we got to the final component, and this is what really tied everything together, everything that we'd done so far, at least. So we had developed the system according to the specifications provided by the client project team. When it came time to work on the final component, we actually discovered that there was not agreement at the top of the organization about how the design should work. This was a disaster. I might have cried once or twice. Not that much. Everything that we'd done to that point was now in question. Literal years of work in one direction were now being challenged by someone who had been aware of everything that we're doing. They were in many of the meetings where we made decisions, but at the end, his view of where we were headed was not really aligning with his own. So we did our best to recover. We provided estimates and reports, many reports, to explain what the cost would be for each of the two separate approaches, how each of them would work. Like, there was so many details in these reports, but still after months of wrangling, we were not able to reach a consensus, and we did have to leave that project unfinished. So this was my first real experience with project failure. And wow, it was a whole thing. But when this does happen, it is easy to look at the situation and point fingers away from yourself. But we do have to take full responsibility for project success, since we do take full responsibility for project success, then we should also take responsibility when things fail, right? So in our postmortem discussions on this project, we asked ourselves what we could do differently and realized that the signs had actually been there to see all along. When someone with the authority to derail a project is present but disengaged in discussions, that's a pretty big red flag that requires careful communication. It's not enough to share information and hope that stakeholders are taking it in. You've got to test their understanding to make sure that they're fully on board with the direction. And this can mean asking questions and getting them to respond to you, repeat what I just said back to me type thing, because just trusting that folks are reading reports, especially, nobody reads reports. Also something to keep in mind. You can spend days writing up a really nice 10-page report. They'll maybe look at one picture in it and that's about it. So be prepared for that as well.
One of the big challenges, I think, is that it's really easy, if you're not actually building the thing, to lean on abstractions or leap over, make logical leaps over the inconvenient things that might be an impediment to project success. And so when you're not engaged and you're not really thinking about what's happening, then you can have like a very rosy view of what's possible. And you don't have to have a disciplined view at all if you're just kind of making it up in your own head. So testing that understanding, not just of what the goals are, what does success look like, but also what are the implications of our choices? Like, what are the consequences of the choices that we've made together? Because what happens is if those consequences start to materialize and people aren't happy about them, and people in the project team didn't fully take ownership of those choices and the consequences when the choice was made, that's a vulnerability. Now you're going to be dependent on people's power and reputation and authority, right? Whether that individual who has a different understanding than you do of reality, are they able to impose their view on the organization? And if they can, that spells huge project trouble. I've got another project breaker I want to talk about now. And that's the one you see on the slide. So authority misaligned with the project team. That's a challenge that we've talked about, and you have to overcome it. But I think misaligned or diffuse responsibility can be even more dangerous. When accountability for project success is spread among many people in the organization, it's up to the project lead to make process adjustments that support this configuration. We find that bringing as many people in this group together as possible, as frequently as possible, helps to ensure that collective responsibility doesn't become collective failure. So we find it useful in cases like this to splinter accountability if possible, so that each person has an agreed responsibility that relates to their special concerns on the project. It's also important to identify the leaders who manage your team and work out these challenges directly if you can. In multi-layered organizations with a lot of different departments interacting, this can be really difficult if each of those departments is responsible for a different crucial element. Generating buy-in from all stakeholders is a way to counteract this tendency, and that often requires a process that cuts across organizational boundaries. Okay, that's a point that I want to really land with you guys. The existing organizational boundaries are there for good reasons. They are there because they create a structure that allows the organization to do its work well. But that might not be the optimal organizational approach for your project. Your project might need to engage a multidisciplinary team from different organizational departments in order to find success, and breaking down the barriers between those and building an ad hoc project governance team that aligns with your organizational boundaries. That might be a way to address diffuse responsibility and authority together. If you can get those stakeholders, if you can get enough of their time, okay, and if you can get them together and you have the ability to build consensus, and get folks to take accountability as the group that has collective responsibility, then you're getting somewhere.
These kind of organizational challenges are often married to what we think of as cultural issues, organizational values, beliefs, attitudes, and rules that present difficulties to achieving project goals. This can come in many different forms. It's always important to be attuned to the culture of the team you're working with, especially so when you begin to suspect that the culture itself is the root of the challenge. It's not easy to affect culture change, and it might not even be advisable for the organization overall, even when that culture is getting in the way of success on a particular project. One place we look for clues on this is in the structure of an organization and the challenges that it is likely to create. A common challenge that we see in software development organizations is an overemphasis in one area. Culture issues very rarely come from one person or department's overt attempt to create a tense workplace. More often than not, it's a small, everyday actions that over time add up to have a negative impact on the team or organization. If you guys think about this, you can probably all think of a time when, even if it wasn't work, but it could be a friend group, it could be school group, little things happened repeatedly. And then you realized, oh man, apparently this group is just like cool with making inappropriate jokes. Yuck, right? Even though you never thought it was going to go there, that kind of thing can happen. It's not always inappropriate jokes, but in a friend group, it might be.
All right. I mentioned this a little bit on the last slide, but sometimes there is a part of the overall team. Can we just look at this woodcut? I just really like this woodcut. So this is, of course, from an illustration from George Orwell's novel Animal Farm. And I think it's apt for this topic. When you have one part of the overall team that has an outsized influence in the organization, their needs come first, their problems are the top priority. A lot of times there's a good reason this is the case. Generally, the subcomponent of your organization that is like this are the money makers, or they're very, very important to either securing or making the money. And there can be a lot of good reasons why that's the case, but it's important to recognize it and to think about the mitigation strategies. We've had challenges on software projects when the folks who design user interfaces and user experience are the people who have the primary authority in the software development process. This can lead to inflated budgets and timelines when requests that come from design are not grounded in the reality of their impact on the overall development team, or indeed on the scope of the problem that is being solved. It doesn't matter who it is, though. If it's impossible to say no to one group in the organization, then that group actually holds the key to project success or failure. As an outsider with limited control, there's not much that I can do to change that. So it's critical to adjust the process to recognize the true weight of each group. And surfacing this can lead to some uncomfortable conversations. We really try to take a diplomatic approach. I think that taking that kind of approach serves us well. But ultimately, we have to make sure that our process is aligned with the real power in the organization when it comes to the project that we're working on. And if we haven't done that, then the project's at risk before we start. Do you have any comments on this, Lauren?
Yes. So I feel like that octopus very frequently. So that's something to prepare yourself for and be capable of doing, I guess, answering the phone while pouring coffee. But let's be real, nobody calls me, it's all texts. So projects can fail when there are too many tasks piled onto too few shoulders. You'll sometimes see this happen in growing organizations when a key person with unique skills gets loaded with more and more responsibility to the point that it becomes difficult to achieve momentum on any one task. Sometimes you might even find yourself being this person. For example, if there's one person in the company who really understands databases and the data needs of the organization, that it can happen that this person gets your project added to their portfolio, even though they're already working away and fully engaged on their primary tasks. It might not make sense to the organization to add more resources in this area, but the work you need from them is a bridge too far, and they turn out to be less effective than you anticipated. And you also feel like a jerk when you know that somebody is really busy, but they're your only contact on a specific topic, and you feel like you're bothering them by asking them a question that you need the answer for so that somebody else can move forward. It's tough.
Wow, it feels like you've lived this more than once. The only way that I found to mitigate this challenge is to support the individual and try to right-size their responsibilities as best we can, at least for the duration of the project. The first step is for the individual in question to agree that they have a problem. And sometimes you'll find that that's a challenge. You wouldn't think that it would be, but people who end up in this kind of spot, you're the superhero for this particular problem in your organization. They also tend to be the kind of people who enjoy being a key person and being needed in a crisis, and that feeling of importance to a task becomes important to them. So you've got to get them on board, and you've got to get that person to understand that that context switching has a cost, and that it's better to have somebody who is maybe not as experienced doing one of their tasks that is maybe lower risk or lower stakes than for them to not succeed at any of their tasks, which becomes an increasing risk when you start to spread yourself too thin. And once you've got that person on board, then you can advocate to the organization more broadly for the needs of the project. But if you see that one person is the bottleneck on your project, you've got to get them on board first, or you actually are creating risk by calling it out. It's very dangerous to call out anything about an individual in an organization if you don't have that individual's agreement. Poor communication. I feel like this one could be a talk in itself. We've already touched on it a little bit earlier. Communication challenges are constant, and project processes need to take them into account. As project professionals, we collect, retain, and share a lot of information. It's not good to have a process with a lot of communication if that communication isn't effective or isn't reaching its target. And one kind of poor communication that I specifically want to talk about is incomplete consultation. And we see this challenge a lot in projects that have ambitious timelines. There's a huge rush to get started. We got to get moving. We got this big project problem to solve. We got to go. And to get started moving based on initial discussions. But what we found is that detailed scoping and determining requirements can end up getting pushed to a later point in the project than is desirable. Or you rush through it because there's an aggressive timeline that's breathing down everybody's neck. The risk is that there will ultimately be a requirement uncovered that was missed that breaks the assumptions the project has been operating under. We've seen this so many times that we've developed our own business process to account for it, the scoping process that we talked about earlier. Generally, we just won't engage on a software development project until we've gone through a dedicated process of initial requirements gathering, scoping, and estimating. Obviously, there's business reasons that we do this. We're producing value, and we want that value to be recognized, ideally without entering into a larger commitment before we even know what that commitment will be. But besides the business reasons, we found that the pattern has big benefits for project success. We take the time to understand our client requirements, and we chase down the risks that are hidden in the details. There's still always lots to uncover as you go along. The issues of scope creep are not something that you can fix with any magic bullet. But what we find is that if the changes are smaller and more manageable, when we've spent a chunk of time focusing only on setting up the project. Probably this is the most single impactful process change that we've made at P42, and we make a lot of them, and we make a lot of them quite frequently. Everything that we do as technologists rests on a foundational infrastructure and software environment.
Generally, timelines that are too optimistic come from outside software teams. How many of you in here are developers? Yeah. How many of you guys? Yeah. How many of you guys have been given a project and a deadline for that project, and you were like, who made this decision? Yeah, right. It definitely happens. That comes up. If you've got an inexperienced team, the technical group might also give you time estimates that are optimistically short. But generally speaking, where we see the problem is when budget and scope are not well aligned, and that's generally imposed by the business. This is the biggest risk of all. You can't put, this is Doug's line, 10 pounds of potatoes into a 5-pound bag, and it's not a good idea to try. I like that line.
It's never pretty.
No, it wouldn't be. There is a mitigation technique for this that's very effective, and we use it on every project. Time estimates come from the developer who is going to do the work after we've built out the detailed list of granular tasks. To us, granular means that we try to break every task down into components until each one takes less than a day. I might pad the developer's estimate, but I'll never decrease it. Partly, this is because the person closest to the work is the person who is in the best position to estimate it. More importantly, I don't know how you would hold a programmer accountable for delivery time if they didn't get to examine and estimate the task. So many organizations get this wrong, and it's uncomfortable because in a lot of places, you'll find that businesses don't want to commit to a project until it understands the potential cost. It's fair, but if you don't estimate from a detailed, vetted, granular task list, you're just guessing. Something that I picked up from Doug when I had not been working with him for too long and was still kind of learning the ropes of what my goal was as a project manager. I was struggling with a dev who would never give estimates. I said, how long is this going to take? And he'd be like, I don't know. I can't even guess. And I'm like, this is your job, is to figure it out. Give me something. And he couldn't. And I'd be like, Doug, I'm going to smack this guy. What do I do? And Doug goes, okay, think of it like this. You know how to get from Windsor to Kingsville. If you had to drive from Windsor to Kingsville, you would know how to get there and about how long it would take. But if you had to walk from here to Kingsville, you might not necessarily know the best way to take, because maybe you could cut across some fields. Maybe you could take some back roads. And you also don't know how long it's going to take, because you're going to get tired halfway through. Maybe you're going to decide to run part of it. Some things just might go faster than others. And that really opened my eyes to exactly what it looks like when a developer is trying to estimate how long something is going to take. Because yeah, you know where you're starting, you know where you got to go, but filling in the blanks can be tough. Now, because I have experience with walking and with Essex County, I could make a guess that it would take me a few hours-ish to walk to Kingsville from here. And that's probably good enough for an estimate in this case. So it would be the same thing with my dev when he's trying to estimate how long it's going to take for him to finish module A. Well, part A of module B, however, then he can give me that rough idea. But what I never want to do is be like, you said it's going to take you 100 hours to do this. Cool, you have 75. Have I had clients do that to me? Yes. Did I get mad? Yes. The only solution to that is that if you can't give us all the time, you don't get all of the functionality and features. Got to give somewhere, right? It's that, what is it? Cheap, fast, good?
Yeah.
Yeah, good too.
Yeah. When you identify a timeline problem, the only thing to do is make adjustments in scope. You can't make something happen faster than it naturally will happen. If it takes, I don't know how long it takes an egg to hatch. If it takes 6 weeks for an egg to hatch, you can't make it faster. There's no way to do that. All you'll end up with is a broken egg. And so with that in mind, you have to look at ways in a software project to be able to pull out work items. And the only thing that makes sense is to pull out items of scope. It's not a comfortable conversation. It's never a comfortable conversation to have when you have to make scope adjustments. And so for that reason, we talked about the estimating process, and that's really important. On the business side, we also budgeting is separate from estimating. Once we've estimated, there's a multiplier that gets applied to budgeting. And I think that that's just a smart way to go for any kind of estimation, but especially in software development. And that multiplier will vary based on perceived risk. And risk can come from a lot of different directions. And what you're doing is you're building in some kind of buffer or padding to prevent project failure. Right. And we've worked this out, business processes to be able to provide some certainty to our clients and an understanding of what costs will be, while at the same time building flexibility into the process. It's not that easy, but it's a worthwhile goal, because if you have too rigid a scope and your timeline is too optimistic, your project will fail.
So what we do as part of that too is the estimate that we give the client in terms of dollar amount. It's a not to exceed quote. So if we end up not needing that extra time given to us by the multiplier that we applied, then it's like a discount for the client. They don't have to pay for that time because we didn't use it, right? We'll also move hours around when we need to. So if Doug's doing the development work and he needs a few more hours and I'm project managing, but it's been pretty smooth so far, so I haven't had to use all of mine, we'll give some of my hours to him. And to the clients, it's costing the same. They don't really care whether, the money's being spent on me or him. They just want the project to be done, right? So thinking about it in those terms helps as well. So our quotes will have a line for project management, a line for solution architect, a line for developer, maybe front end and back end will be split out kind of depending on the project. But I find those ways help to kind of keep everything aligned as well.
Yeah, so everybody's circumstance is going to be different, and certainly our business realities are going to be different from the organizational realities that any one person who's listening to us is going to face. The important thing is to understand your context and try to figure out how can you build the same kind of safety tools into your projects that we built into ours. Your solutions might look very different, but it's thinking about what the issues and challenges are likely to be and how do we mitigate it. No matter what your context is, there's a way to approach projects that will mitigate timeline risk. It might not be ours, but I promise you there is one. Okay, now we're going to talk about skill issues. Okay, another very, very touchy topic. You cannot run a successful project without the right skills on board. I've seen projects crash on these rocks a lot of times. And so we're going to cover a few subcategories of skill issues because they each have their own indicators and solutions. I'd also like to add that I'm borrowing this term from the fighting game community, but I certainly don't mean to imply when I say skill issues that there's something wrong with the individual doing the work. And I don't think that you can generally blame the individual doing the work unless they lied on their resume or something like that. It's the responsibility of the organization to get the right people to the right place in terms of skills and to mitigate mismatches when they arise. It's pretty rare to encounter a problem like this that doesn't have its ultimate roots in training, communication, or appropriate expectations. And I see this gap probably the most often in technical projects. Organizations, especially smaller ones, will stand up software development groups without considering the depth of skill and experience required to build and maintain a code asset. It's really, really hard to build good quality software, and leadership is essential. There is not a lot that you can do about technical leadership challenges as a project lead, aside from interrogating timelines and expectations. Generally, though, this kind of problem will emerge quite early in a project. If your spider senses are telling you that something doesn't add up, if you're hearing things that don't quite make sense and you're not sure why, you've got to find out and you got to investigate that. You definitely need to take a diplomatic approach when you are inquiring as to whether the technical leadership for a given project knows what they're doing, but you have to do it. The best way to communicate a challenge like this is to mitigate it with rework and QA. So you've got to plan for your rework and QA process to be a little bit more robust and a little bit more time for rework. If you notice this and you're embedded in an organization, build the evidence in your own project and address the risk to the project timeline. The bigger issue does not matter to you. Person X is not in the right position, is not your problem. Person X is a barrier to my project succeeding, and I can help them by doing Y, Z, and A. That is your business. Trying to get person X moved out of that role or undermining them or gossiping about them or any of those sort of things, those are all anti-patterns that are going to get you further away from your goal, not closer. It's really a situation where you have to find a way to address the risk the best way you can, and see what you can do within the context of your project to mitigate the issue and then move on. Okay, besides technical leadership, we also have people on the technical team. Individual contributors are not an interchangeable commodity. You know, a developer is not a developer is not a developer. If you're doing anything that's complex or challenging, a team that's inexperienced with the problem domain or the tech stack are going to struggle, and sometimes in subtle ways that's not easy to identify. I know from experience that project estimation is really fuzzy when you don't have real world experience close to the task at hand. Organizations that aren't technically oriented are more likely to fall into the trap of assuming that a developer is a developer is a developer, or that building a small website is proof that you can take on a complex web application. And this is one of those areas where it's really just good to know the team that you're working with. Not every developer is comfortable acknowledging their ignorance, especially in a field where your skills, knowledge, and experience are the currency that determine like your status and your value. And so it helps to ask direct questions about team experience and have a plan to cover the gaps. Assuming we're already in project and these challenges didn't come up in estimating, you've got a project that's at risk immediately if your development team doesn't have the skills that you would want for them to deliver the work. What I like to do is pull forward as much technical risk as I can. So if we have activities that are in our wheelhouse, we feel comfortable and confident in them, we're going to push those off as far as we can into the future because those are safe. The likelihood that one estimated day is going to be one day on the ground is so much higher that's the stuff that you want happening at the end. It's better just to not use time on things that are in your wheelhouse because once you've spent that time, you can't get it back. There might be areas of scope that you can trim to make room for the learning that has to happen. That's another place to look. But there's something that Fred Brooks said that's probably the line that resonates the most with me. And it's the one that I use the most often when I'm talking to other people about software development. And that is that you should always build one to throw away because you will anyway. So you might as well plan to. And what Brooks was trying to say there is that if you haven't built a particular solution before, you're going to screw it up the first time. How bad you screw it up is variable, and whether that screw up is going to be material to the project success or failure. But you always will do a less optimal job than you would have if you had experience with that exact problem. So as a young programmer, I thought that was just permanently cynical, right? I thought that was just not true, but my experience has proved it to be true. The first effort in unfamiliar territory is just not likely to be as satisfactory as the next one. Sometimes you just don't know how all the pieces are going to come together and where the problems are going to be. But there are strategic ways that you can mitigate this. One thing I do is look for opportunities on safe projects to give a little bit of room for experimentation with techniques that we want to add to our toolbox. We also like to look for small opportunities that are high value because those give a chance to experiment with techniques in an environment where the business is getting enough out of the end product that you've got the runway to do it. So even if you're not, making commercial software, but if you're inside an organization, you want to look for those opportunities where you're going to deliver so much value to the business by building something new that they're willing to do some experimentation and to pay for some experimentation time. And that's a way that you can help build up the capabilities of your team over time. There's really, if the technical team isn't up to the job, something's got to give. So in project, this is one that is just super hard to fix. But once you've seen it and once you've identified it, at least you can try to do those things to upskill that team and move them forward.
All right. In environments where skills are limited, you will often see problems with QA and testing. But even here, experienced teams can have a big blind spot. Software validation processes are a big area, and there's a lot of debate around it. Constant debate. I think this is one of the things that we really struggle to get right as an industry. Informal methods are all right for very small or not very important projects, but for anything significant, if you don't control the bugs will control your project. You want to use the least amount of validation that will give you the results you need, because these processes are time-consuming. Over-testing can represent a timeline risk, but that's small potatoes. Again, with the potatoes, Doug. Compared to the kind of problems that under-testing creates. All bugs are not created equal. Some problems are shallow and easily resolved, but others, especially if they're subtle, can stop a project in its tracks and blow the whole thing up. This is one of those areas where it's really valuable to have experienced and thoughtful technical leadership on a project. Doug, he is very good at this. He engages project managers and technical leadership in a conversation about what level of testing and what kind of testing is needed in the same way that he will tune other project management processes up or down. So again, this is something that usually comes earlier in the process. So probably like during scope zero, during sprint zero, while we're scoping, boom, we will have the conversation about what are the established protocols for testing If you don't have any, are you interested in learning some? Things like that. So Doug, you have to read this part, though.
I will take this part. But yeah, I just want to pick up on that too. And I think this is an area where developers, and maybe this is you, if you're a developer, developers will have very specific beliefs about what adequately tested software looks like and what an adequately tested piece of code is. My belief is that is completely context dependent on the solution that you're building and the system that your code is going to live in. And there is just not a one size fits all answer. And I think if you listen to the business, you will under test. And if you listen to the developers, you will over test, is a good rule of thumb, and try to find some place in between. So I get to tell a story here. I spent several years embedded with a data team at a large organization. And over the years, this team's mandate had grown from simple business report writing to far more complex ETL processes, data extractions, feeding machine learning models and so forth with data. This was far more complicated than just writing little reports. And when I got there weren't any formal validation tools in use. And that makes sense in an environment when most of what you're doing is providing small bits of data to subject matter experts. When you make a mistake in that environment, people can see it pretty quickly. And a super lightweight quality process makes sense because the end user is an expert and the end user is going to say, your numbers don't make sense to me, do it again. But over the years, my perception was that the complexity of requests that we were fielding was growing faster than our validation process. And I think that might have even led to some perception issues in the business about that business unit. So in that environment, when I ended up fielding a lot of the more complex requests, I decided to build automated quality tools into my software development process, mostly just to save validation time. So if I was working on a big compliance reporting project, I built a data validation structure right into the application's database so that anybody with query access and a doubt could go in and double check results on their own. And I had a way to validate every new piece of data and every query against a structure that I knew would work well. So that worked really well, and I've carried those techniques forward into other data engineering projects that I've worked on. And I think that's another key piece. As you move through your career, whether it's as a technologist or as a project leader, you're going to acquire these nuggets of value, little techniques and tools that you learn along the way that are that solve a problem on a project. And I think that building out your toolbox with a little bit of intentionality and thinking about the lessons that you've learned, and when something happens and you mitigate a problem in the project and you think to yourself, oh, that's how I did that. I talked to Jane, and then Jane solved the problem with Joe. Make a note of that and internalize it, because you're probably going to find more opportunities to use that same technique to solve problems.
Once again, thanks everybody. We're going to close this off now, and we'll see you later.